Welcome back, everyone. Our next talk is titled, Who Pays the Piper? The Caller of the Tune. The talk is given by Don Christie. So can you please all welcome Don Christie?
Right, well, thanks for that. So I'm just wondering how many people were at the dinner last night. Yeah, well done. I managed to skip that last night. I got away. Consider this your personal hour, your well-being hour. I don't mind if you feel your eyelids droop, you feel like going to sleep, or anything like that. This is not a talk about how C can affect the kernel. Surely the answer to that was don't overwrite the end of your strings, but hopefully it was a bit more than that. So when I gave this talk, of course, when I put in the synopsis for this talk, I wasn't expecting not to give a talk between the Canterbury Tech Summit and now, and I've spent the whole summer wondering what I was going to say. So first of all, I'll do some introductions. Who am I? I'm a former C developer, Unix database type person. I'm currently managing director of Catalyst IT. I'm one of the founders of that company. Catalyst has been around for a long time in IT terms, unless you work for IBM. So we're 22 years old, and what I figured out recently was in those 22 years, we've actually either founded ourselves or co-founded 10 companies, 6 of which are still around. 3 of them are services companies, so Catalyst.net, which is our New Zealand company, Catalyst Australia, Catalyst UK, and now Catalyst Ireland, thank you Brexit. We have a Catalyst Cloud company. We co-founded Totara. We were doing internet measurements and stuff like that. So I guess what I'm trying to say, and we've got 300 employees and we're still around, so that's not too bad. And we're not Google, I know that. We're not Red Hat. But we are a free open source company, and we've been doing free open source software development, contribution, product leadership for that whole 22 years. So this is kind of our experiences type talk, and thinking about what effect money has on the free software movement and why it might be important to us. So if you look at our website, we automatically count the number of projects that Catalyst employees have contributed to, and there's about 174 of those at the moment. Projects such as Moodle, Mahara, Koha, Samba, OpenStack. You might have heard Fei Long talking about our OpenStack contributions. Hot Potato, James and Callum were talking about. This is work by our operations team that's just gone upstream. It's kind of core to us. This free software stuff is core to us. But actually, so is making money, and so is being able to pay ourselves. So what I want to sort of cover off today is really why is it important that we should think about contributors and users of free and open source software getting money, being able to live and pay their dental bills and send their kids to school and eat. What models are there for paying people? That might seem fairly obvious. How can we do this and still stay true to the principles of free software? And finally, fundamentally, hopefully making you all feel a little bit good about things and saying, well, we don't actually have to stress this stuff too much. It'll all work out. And of course, when I submitted this talk, Red Hat had not been sold to IBM for $34 billion. So I could almost stop here and leave that up, just to keep you awake. More on that later, but that is the biggest software deal ever, regardless of whether we're talking about open source software or closed software, proprietary software. That is the biggest software deal in the history of IT. Well, that's quite interesting. So why is it important that we think about being able to give people a living as users, contributors, integrators of free and open source software? I think there's quite a lot of discussion around this sort of stuff. Diversity, my God, most of the software out there even in this wonderful community that we are people that are written by people that look vaguely like me. It doesn't make it fit for purpose. Kathy gave a really good talk yesterday about voice processing and open source tools to process voice, and how most of the data sets use male voices. And so basically you're cutting out 50% of the population from being able to use these tool sets because our data sets are so biased and our software is biased. Now, a lot of the people we need to integrate into our community and bring into our community so our software is sustainable, usable, broadly applicable, are already giving up a lot of their time as volunteers. We know, for example, that women are already overloaded in terms of giving away their labor for free. So how can they give away more of their time, to participate in this free software movement? Same issue with people that don't necessarily have a lot of money. They're very time poor. Sometimes they're carrying out more than one job. So we need to think about how to be far more inclusive. New Zealand and Australia both have a terrible track record about including our indigenous populations in our technology thing. And there was an interesting question at the end of the talk the other day about, the 20 years of LCA. Congratulations, by the way, what a fantastic conference, that will never change. And the three gentlemen that were giving the talk said, well, we can't think of any way to change that. Well, I can. I think, a challenge to the organisers of LCA is really how do we reach out to our indigenous populations of Australia and New Zealand and bring the promise of freedom and free technology to those populations and enable them and enable those parts of a society that have been missing out. So those are some of the reasons. You've got to remember, we talked about that speech technology issue that came up yesterday. But also remember that the biggest social media platform was written by a privileged brat to stalk women at university. That's Facebook. That's the origins of Facebook. No wonder it's no longer fit for purpose for our society. No wonder people are beginning to think about how bad a platform Facebook is. So we need to be thinking about these things, and we need to think about how to bring more communities into this community that we have already. So some of the counterpoints I've seen to this argument is that somehow we're corrupting the ideal. When we talk about money, we're corrupting the ideal. I saw an article or blog post talking about Ruby on Rails, another amazing project, but talking about the fact that there are 3,000 contributors. All of them are volunteers. I don't know how they can tell that, actually. And that somehow to associate money with contribution would make the project less pure. I don't believe that. It's a similar sort of argument that people like myself have used for many years about meritocracy. What we've actually done is, because we've been in this community for so long, is set ourselves up to be gatekeepers. And we've kind of displayed, and I'm talking about we because I mean me, we've displayed a stunning lack of self-awareness as we've done this. And although this community is packed full of wonderful people who've achieved wonderful things, we've actually stopped people joining us. And one of the some of the talks that I've listened to this week have really emphasized that and really been a learning experience for me. I think that's changing. And so I don't think talking about money and free and open source software is changing that, although I do understand people's concerns. Because freedom is important, right? We do understand that, and it's fundamental to how Catalyst thinks about things. But freedom, as Richard Stallman has always said, doesn't have to be free. This is a poster from the Second World War, where the US government was trying to raise money to fight for freedom, as they would say. And the idea was that you would buy war bonds to protect the freedom of speech. It's not new. And the other thing that is so important about in freedom is thinking about, well, what are the outcomes that we're after? Why am I Still talking about free software, and I'm not talking about, I'm not going to talk about open core or closed models. It's because the philosophy that the community has brought has an outcome that is pretty fundamental. This is a photograph of a high school in Western Province in Zambia, which I visited a few years ago because I was born there. And that quote there says, "When books are opened, we discover that we have wings." And I think of opened as in, open source opened. But one of the things I believe is that the future of knowledge in this digital age is in our hands. The future of the Enlightenment it rests on our shoulders. We, in the digital community, are the community that are going to make sure that knowledge is open and the Enlightenment is available to everyone. Without us, it'll get shut down. So what I'm saying in this part of the talk is, yes, I'm talking about money, and no, I'm not talking about sacrificing freedom. Does that make sense? Good. I know I can go off point a bit. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about 3 projects that Catalyst has a close association with. So these are projects where we either have almost a product development team, or we have a blend of a product development team and a team that sells services and so on around it. And they're interesting in their different ways. So Koha is a Maori word. It means a gift. In many contexts, I would see it as a contribution. So often you'll go to a marae and receive amazing hospitality, but you bring your contribution as well. So Koha was a library management system developed for a library in a small town an hour's drive north of Wellington, Levin, to fix a Y2K bug. And the previous platform they'd used had gone out of support. The company had gone out of business. So Katapo, a Wellington company, developed this internet-based library management system. And they said to the local council and the Horowhenua Library Trust, you should make this open source. We're a small company. We might not exist in 20 years' time. So they did. They made it. They licensed it under the GPL. And I think the first Apache arrived from Detroit in about the year 2000. And that was from a car manufacturer, one of the biggest car manufacturers in Detroit, who picked up the code and used it to catalog their manuals. And it's now used in at least 15,000 libraries across the world. It's translated into dozens of languages. It runs the entire public library system of Turkey. It runs Delhi Public Library, which has the biggest turnover of books. They lend magazines in 10-minute slots. Yeah, it's a phenomenal thing. And you can see as well, this is just a snap, and it does 6 monthly releases. This is just a snapshot of the credits for the last major release, 1811. Bunch of libraries listed there. There must be about a dozen companies globally that offer serious support for Koha, including Catalyst. There's Bywater in the US, Biblibre in France. Lots of contributors, including students that we get in every year who do a bunch of bug fixes, high school students. It's a very well-governed project. Very, very diverse. And these companies, including Catalyst, are making money out of it. There was a time when money did impact Koha. If you do a search for Koha like ILS on the internet, you'll come up with the official Koha open source community website. And then you'll see this one, which is actually koha.org. And the history of that is a company called LibLime, a number of years ago, bought Katapo's library business. And that was all fine. LibLime was already a Koha support company in the US. But then they themselves got bought by a much bigger company, and that company had a look at its assets and decided that they owned Koha, and that they were going to go chasing trademarks across the world, and that they were going to create a a more closed platform and do proprietary extensions, all this sort of stuff. Well, the problem for LibLime was that actually there was a very strong community out there, and there was a very strong license out there. So this is a GPL licensed piece of software. And the community just said, well, nah, sorry. We're going to carry on doing our thing. Sure, you've got the US trademark. We had to fight them hard to get the New Zealand trademark, but we collectively, the community, prevailed. And Koha, the open source platform, has gone from strength to strength. The governance has got stronger. The usage has exploded. The 6-monthly release cycle means that LibLime's Koha has just stagnated. And it's a real community success. So, yeah, you know, the troll was pretty big, but it lost. Trolls lose, we know that, right? And so that was a case of where, you know, potentially big venture capital sources of funding were going to threaten an open source community and so on, but they lost. I'll just move on to the Samba project. I don't know if any of you were in Wellington for the LCA that we had in Wellington. Anyone at that? Right. Do you remember Jeremy Allison's talk? I got permission from Jeremy to use the next 2 slides. What he did want me to emphasize was that his view of Microsoft has changed somewhat in the recent years, and what he thought of Microsoft in 2010 or 9 is no longer what he thinks about them now. So I've got that out of the way. But of course, I mean, Samba is apart from the Linux kernel, I'd say the iconic project in our community. Dates back to 1992, I believe. Reverse engineered key components of the Microsoft stack, so that Microsoft, which was trying to use its dominance in the client space to destroy every competitor in the server space. And it's prevented Microsoft doing that. And you know, there is no bigger company than Microsoft, or certainly wasn't at the time. When Sun brought an EU case against Microsoft for monopolistic behavior, a bunch of different parties joined that, including, I believe, IBM and Oracle and Samba. Well, all the corporates got bought out. So there was a deal done, and they pulled out of the case. The one organization that stayed was the Samba project. As Jeremy puts it, you know, he and Rusty and whoever else was involved, you know, they could have earned a lot of money, but there was no point, because the project would have prevailed. It would have sustained. It would be whack-a-mole, you know, as soon as Jeremy had earned his millions from Microsoft, Andrew would have popped up. And then if Andrew had been bought off, somebody else would have popped up. So that court case cost Microsoft hundreds and hundreds of millions of euros. But it also changed their behavior. You know, Microsoft now claims to be the largest open source company in the world. Maybe it is. But things have come round, and that was as a result of our community not being diverted by money. There's plenty of money on the table, but we retained our ability to stay true to our ideals and not to have the platforms undermined. And yes, this was a slide that Jeremy put up. He said, remember, IBM was once as feared and hated as Microsoft is today, and that's what he's saying is different. And look, the elephant did learn some new tricks. We're no longer communists, I don't think. I haven't. Maybe we are. We were really lucky a few LCAs ago. This kind of strange, mad Australian talked to somebody else at Catalyst and said, hey, look, you know, I'm one of the core developers of Samba AD. Active Directory, of course, being the next point of lock-in that Microsoft has, and really is a big way that Microsoft gets people into 365 and Azure and so on. And so I was quite amazed when Samba brought out this AD. And so Andrew, you know, sort of said, oh, I wouldn't mind working in New Zealand. Have you got a job for me? And we said, well, have you got any work? He said, yeah, we've got some work. And he brought a client along. And I kind of thought, well, look, if it doesn't work out, we'll turn him into a half-decent PHP developer and he can start churning out some Drupal sites, which nearly happened. But we've now got a team of, well, you might have seen Andrew's talk the other day. You know, we've now got a team of 7 people. We're being paid some significant amount of money by the French government, by some other major corporates in the world, to scale Samba AD, to add new features to it, to make it a better product. Now, the interesting thing, though, is most of the time, we don't get paid unless the code gets dropped into core. So we have to play really nicely with upstream and the Samba project. 50% of the team's time is spent on unchargeable work for the project. So, you know, the way these projects work, as you all know, before anything can go through, it has to go through peer review, QA, you know, release, maintainer approval, all that sort of stuff. And none of that can be within the same organization. So you have to ask somebody else in the world to give up their time to do that sort of stuff, which means that on our side, we have to reciprocate. And so, you know, Andrew and his team are spending a lot of their time doing peer review, QA, bunch of stuff, moving people onto GitLab. Doing test automation, which means that the whole Samba project is actually accelerating again. It's got a new lease of life, I would say, in many ways. It's quite fascinating. And we're paying 7 people to work on a project that otherwise would be doing PHP development, which, you know, is not to be sneered at, but I'm just saying. Interesting enough, that team is quite capable, and they're now also doing development work for network card manufacturers, for a little bit of stuff for Mozilla occasionally, you know, so some pretty low-level stuff. So we've managed to pay a team of people to contribute to a project that Catalyst as a company has no influence over. Our clients don't say, oh, actually, you've got to take this and do this with it and keep it secret. They don't pay us until stuff gets into core. So that's a pretty neat outcome, I think. Mahara is a project that Catalyst, from a technical perspective and now an operational and governance perspective, have led since 2006, I believe. We started it as a sort of academic partnership with Massey University. This whole idea about student-centered learning was quite new. Mahara gets about 70,000 downloads a year. It's kind of like it sits alongside Moodle. So Moodle will do your learning stuff, and you know, you can go to university, do a course and all this. Mahara is much more about taking your portfolio and doing what you want with it. 70,000 downloads a year. The interesting thing about Mahara is it doesn't earn us a lot of money. We have about 30 paying clients directly to Catalyst. That's changing, actually, specifically because more and more what are called apprenticeship degrees and vocational type degrees are being offered, particularly in the UK. But we've found it's a very important project for our company in that it gets us into, let's say, 70,000 institutions, but the reality is maybe 10, 20, 30,000 institutions. And our name is there that it wouldn't otherwise be there. So yes, we're earning some money. We'd like to earn a lot more money out of it, but the reality is it's a very positive impact on our marketing. We have a big, you know, probably about a third of our global business is based on the e-learning market. So the point about putting this slide up here is that, you know, there's no magic bullet, right? Just as if you were doing a startup and thinking, I'm going to build this, security product, let's call it KP, and take on the world, and success will come instantaneously. It doesn't, right? But it doesn't mean it's not worth chasing. And, you know, you do have this kind of, how do you value something versus who gets rewarded? I remember sitting down with Martin Duguiamos, who is Mr. Moodle and runs Moodle HQ. And this is years ago. He did a back-of-the-envelope calculation, and he reckoned that Moodle was worth about $1 billion in terms of value. In terms of if people were paying Blackboard for the same platform, that would be about $1 million worth of value that they've added. The problem for us, in a way, is that Tim Berners-Lee, Linus Torvalds, Vint Cerf, and so on, have kind of taken the internet and taken software out of public accounting because it's free, right? And so it's a bit like, what's the value of a sun drying your washing on the washing line versus, which is not measured, versus if everyone had a dryer and were using electricity and paying Noel Leemings for a clothes dryer, you'd be able to value that, the cost of drying. So we're kind of in that thing. So, should we be rewarded for the value we offer, or are we just earning what we want to earn? And that's an interesting debate. It's an interesting debate because some of the business models around open source are trying to get money for partnership. Moodle's done that very successfully. And the question is, do we value cash more than code, contributions more than usership, and so on? I do think Red Hat's mantra of buy a brick and get a house is probably the best analogy. So you might get paid for a brick, and the user might get a house, but of course, nobody gets paid the full amount. I think also, just quickly, we need to value users. This is used to be one of my many locals. I had a lot of locals when I lived in Bristol. This is the Llandogo Tro. This is where Long John Silver ran this pub in the Treasure Island novel. Robert Louis Stevenson based it on the real pub. Often in the free open source community, we hear people talking about, riding on the coattails. They're not giving us enough money. We need to value users. Without users, you have no audience. You have no chance of getting any money to pay your developers, artists, contributors, testers, and so on. You need an audience. This guy is playing a piano in Brighton train station in the UK. As far as I can work out there, he's got an audience. He's got the start of a business model, even though he's not charging anyone for it. He's got the start of a business model. And where do we go? I remember my first HTML foray in 1995 or something. I came up with something like this. This was magic. The fact that LibreOffice can allow me to replicate that is super. I'll give you something a little bit less stressful. Red Hat's value was $34 billion US. It's a really healthy company. It's got a growth rate of over 20% year on year. It's got, as far as I can work out, or the way US companies state profitability is pretty opaque, but as far as I can work out, its profitability is generally around about 15–16%. That's fantastic. And that's a totally free and open source company that's been paying thousands of people to contribute, not just to Red Hat, but to Fedora, to the Linux kernel, to Samba, to OpenStack, to a bunch of projects that we all use and benefit from, even though we might not pay Red Hat anything. I once had a conversation with the New Zealand Trade and Enterprise. We'd opened up a business in the UK, and there were government grants available for it. And they would sit down with me every 6 months and say, Don, you should get some money off us and tell us what your business model is. I'd explain open source. They'd say, oh, we don't understand it. And they'd go away for 6 months, and we'd repeat the conversation. And then a friend of mine who used to work for them said, Don, why haven't you had a grant off NZTE? And I said, they don't understand. He said, they don't need to fucking understand, excuse my language. They just need to understand that you're making money. And I think that's about it, isn't it? It comes down to governance, community, licensing. It's pretty simple, straightforward. If you do a good job, if you get things set up, you probably will earn money. You'll probably earn enough. You probably won't be over-influenced by money. I do really recommend the GPL if you are thinking about making something open source. It makes things, thank you. AGPL, yeah. It makes things much clearer and easier. You can spend a lot less time on governance and community stuff because there's a certain expectation set already. HPE were really big on this as a result of the whole OpenStack project. Of course, OpenStack is an enormously successful project, but anyone that's had anything to do with OpenStack knows that the governance of that project is hell. There's far too much time wasted on arguments and committees and so on and so forth. And finally, almost finally, there's still space to have fun. We have a translation for Koha in Klingon. It's worth looking up the programming language Arnold C, which turns all the commands into Arnold Schwarzenegger statements. For recursion, see I'll be back. Of course, we've got Damien Conway is responsible for Acme Bleach, which removes all printable characters for your code, and your code will still run. I don't understand how he did that, but anyway. The Onion has Comcastify.js, which displays your images as if you were running over a really slow connection. So like, do you remember that? I mean, you Australians will know that through NBN, right? They use the same software. And if there's one takeaway I'd like to give, like the one takeaway is it's that free software works because we choose to share, not because we value free labor. That, to me, is a fundamental thing that we always need to remember and keep at the back of our heads. And I learned a lot this week, something about brand and personal brand, so thank you to Shannon for that lesson. Thank you.
Do we have questions?
I don't mind observations as well, because I realize this is a pretty phenomenal audience, so observations are good. Apart from Nicholas's.
I don't. Just to a different context, what do we do with New Zealand government and proprietary software? I mean, I'm a recent arrival to New Zealand. I've been only 16 years here. And, well, for South Island standards, that's recent arrival. But the way of the government thinks or acts, it's, I don't know. I won't put adjectives. My whole point is, do we need to wait until certain government officials just pass away? Is there other strategy? Because just a final point. Live in a small town in the South Island, principal of the high school sends an email saying, oh, we have a free license of Office 365 for your child. And then I go and say, well, I don't want that, and I don't want that to send to all of the other students. Well, everyone can do whatever. We have this, and it's free.
So the current incoming government had some IT policies. The government has signed up to the Digital Nations Charter, and there are about half a dozen principles in that charter, including a commitment to open source software and open standards. The government is committed to using open source at a political level, and it has committed to open algorithms and so on as well, as you're aware. There's a big disconnect between what politicians are able to do, I've discovered, even when they're ministers, and what the civil service will do. The whole yes minister thing is absolutely bang on. But we are a small country, and we can talk to people and we can influence people, and God knows I've been doing it for years and years myself, and you can make progress. And there's some people here from the government digital lab, the innovation lab, all using open source, demonstrating how you can do cross-government agency development, trying to get companies like Catalyst, when we develop stuff, to make it open source and put it in a repository and so on. So we've just got to keep pushing.
At least you can keep Prime Minister for a time.
Yes. Hopefully. We've still got a year and a half to go. One over there.
Just following up on that point about New Zealand government and their perennial Microsoft contract they keep renewing. I think one of the big drivers in New Zealand, especially, is getting into that education in schools and universities early to try and get people out of that you need a Microsoft certification mindset, which is heavily prevalent in IT in New Zealand and government departments, having experience working in a few of them. It is slowly changing, probably not as quickly as everyone here would like. And I think some of that has come about from the popularity of Linux and Mac and cloud computing, pushing Microsoft somewhat out of the university space. But yeah, trying to encourage children to get into the open source earlier will help push those out of the schools using the likes of LibreOffice and stuff. So yeah.
Thank you. And Code Club.
Can I just add something as well, actually? So I think another thing is that we need more technical people going into the political spaces. And I know a lot of people from the technical industry do not like doing that, because you go to the debating chambers and the first thing anyone says is they all act like children. And so people in a technical space don't want anything to do with that. But I think we need more technical people in that space to advise the others of what the right thing is to do. So,
yeah.
Any other questions? Oh, yes.
And there's Arian as well.
Thank you for your talk. Are you seeing any much open source movement into the enterprise resource planning space, which seems more dominated by the commercial entities?
So can you just develop that a little bit more? I didn't quite understand what your question was.
Yeah, are you seeing just any more, I guess, open source applications getting bigger in the ERP space? So business applications, you know, like rostering fleet, financials, like the integrated business softwares. So SAP, Oracle. Are you seeing, do you think, are there any more open source equivalents really competing well in that space?
I mean, I do see some of New Zealand's larger corporates kicking out Oracle as a database, for example, and handing over contracts to companies that are supporting Postgres. There's a company called Enterprise IT in New Zealand that offers support for those sort of platforms, and they're doing really well. We, as Fei Long might have mentioned, are building OpenStack private cloud for corporates in New Zealand, right? It doesn't get, and it's all based on everything is open. So all the scripts that we use, you know, everything that these folks are developing, all gets pushed upstream. Anyone could do it, but they all try and just put their little bit of proprietary stuff in there, and try and make it a little bit special. There's no need for that. You just need to get in there and do it cheaply and quickly. So in some ways, there's more of an appetite at a corporate level. Spark, infamously, has moved to a completely agile organization, apparently. But that also involves them being very strong about saying that they're going to also be favoring the use of open source. So be interesting to see how successful they are in pushing that through. Arian.
In terms of, I have a question, but I'd like to mention something in relation to government. We have had for years, of course, our secret weapon, Pia War, now Andrews, in Australia and New Zealand, who is very, very skilled in making governments shift from the inside and dealing with open data and that kind of thing. I would love Pia to maybe do workshops to us other nerds on being more skillful in that space. I think that would be great, but it is getting done. It's just not getting done in full view because, in a way, the backroom politics seem to be quite effective in shifting things. So my question to you, Don, is we're often, as in we catalysts, as in we nerds, often deploy a lot of open source software in the cloud, and there are a lot of cloud companies offering whatever as a service, which uses open source software, it consumes it, but it's not actually open anymore. It gets modified, and it's no longer actually available to us. Of course, there's the AGPL, which hasn't been applied long enough back to be beneficial to that. How do you see us being able to solve that issue?
So I think that's a question of due diligence. So, it's quite interesting how little due diligence is often done by our government CIOs. They're just shoving stuff in the cloud willy-nilly, sometimes on really insecure platforms. And really, it's just making sure. So, at Catalyst, we have a policy where we can use cloud services so long as we know that the underlying platform is open source and we can shift and lift whenever we want, including bringing it in-house and doing it ourselves. So it doesn't require too much due diligence to do that. I certainly wouldn't insist that people use the AGPL if they don't want to, but yeah. One of the things that I was going to mention is for the organizations that do open core, first of all, thank you very much for your community editions. I don't want to run any of that down. Secondly, can you please give us more opportunity to pay you for the use of your community editions? So often organizations like Alfresco and so on will say, well, as soon as you pay us money, you have to use Enterprise, which is no longer open source. So we, as a company, can't do that. But I'd love to be able to say, here's some money, give us some recognition, and we promote your community edition. That's just a little thing. Sorry, Carl, you've got...
Yeah, just a comment about the use of open source in schools. There was some research I was doing for some work for the NZOSS, but it actually turns out that around about 60% of the computers used in US high schools now are actually Chromebooks. So we've now got a generation of children growing up knowing that there are alternatives to things going through. Now, you could look at a Chromebook and think, yeah, still slightly proprietary, but at least it is providing the start of an open source journey, which I think is absolutely great.
Good. No, you've had your turn. Let somebody else have a go. Anyone else got anything? Are we out of time? That picture's almost as offensive as my Blink one, isn't it? Let's go back.
Can I? No one else? Can I?
Go on then.
Thanks. Jonathan Corbett did a talk about the kernel report and asked a couple of questions. Yes, you. One is if someone is using open source phone, and then the second question was, really? And that led me thinking about how open needs to be open. Yeah, you understand what I mean. And then today we heard about the IoT from the Freedom Software. At the same time, what I'm trying to say is, are we entering in a sort of mixed reality in terms that, okay, the IoT world, it's entering and giving us a new version of open, which is not that open? It's a little bit what you said, people are trying to put little proprietary things on top of that. And okay, we have Chrome, we have one laptop per child, but then everyone is using devices, and IoT will bring us a lot of more devices which are not necessarily that open. So just thinking a little bit further, and what Jonathan say, okay, and I didn't understand the kernel management thing that won't allow that to keep happening.
So I think the things to focus on are the fact that Dana Lewis, right, all the hardware that she had available to do her medical diabetes work was Raspberry Pi and, open hardware, right? It's there, so we can use it. Similarly, you were talking about Chrome. Google's in the same position that Microsoft was with IE6, right? Now, Google's a big corporation, so don't expect them to continuously do no evil. The very least we can do as developers is develop for Firefox first. Make sure what you do works on Firefox is all I'm saying. Just, and then test it onto, of course you've got to deliver it on Chrome if that's where the users are, but do make sure it works on Firefox. So those are the little things that we need to just keep thinking about. Yeah. No, all done. Good. Whew.
Thanks, Don Christie.
Thank you.